Okay, good morning, everyone. So welcome to our first press briefing of the year here at E3G in Brussels. Today, we will take you through the key developments that will shape EU climate politics throughout 2025. E3G is an independent climate think tank where we work towards delivering a safe climate for all. We provide a nuanced understanding of climate politics from our offices here in Brussels, but also from London, Berlin, and Washington, D.C., and across different areas, ranging from finance and resilience, the energy transition, climate diplomacy and geopolitics, clean economy, and politics and governance to leverage the biggest impacts. Before I hand over to our experts who will cover these aspects, just a few housekeeping matters up front. To raise your questions, please type them into the Q&A box. We've set aside approximately 10 minutes at the end of the briefing to dive into your queries and ensure a good exchange of ideas. Please also note that we will provide you with the contact details of our relevant experts and will follow up with an email to this briefing, providing you with further information and pointing you to future outputs that we've planned for the next few weeks and months. Also, today's briefing is off the record. That's because we want to encourage an open discussion where your insights and the information shared here are intended for your background knowledge. If you do want to use any quotes, please make sure to email me before you do so. We can help you fine-tune them or add to them. Also note that we are recording this session and you will be able to receive a copy of it. So now, without further ado, thank you for being here this morning, and I will hand over to Manon Dufour, Executive Director at E3G in Brussels, to start.
Thank you, Isabelle, and good morning. Thank you for joining us. There's no hiding that 2025 would be a volatile year generally and a very decisive one for global climate action. On the one hand, the case for action has never been stronger, whether it's for the extreme weather events that are impacting rich and poor across the globe, or for the benefits the energy transition is yielding in terms of air quality, fossil fuel bills, or security. However, the international climate regime is being shaken already, as will the world order we had grown accustomed to. How the EU fares in this context will depend on how it responds to 5 key tests in our view. First, will it succeed in applying kind of a simplification shock we've heard of without sacrificing the integrity and strength of its regulations? At this time, it's unclear whether pledges by the European Commission to reduce the administrative burden, which is kind of a sensible goal, risk slipping into a rollback of key Green Deal legislation and in doing so strike out the Brussels effect for good. Will the EU find the political will and unity to deploy kind of European solutions to pressing problems? European nations working together can make Europe a lot better off, whether we're talking about industrial policy, financing the investment gap, or building its agency internationally. But political conditions for further European cooperation are far from ideal. How will the EU navigate heightened geopolitical tensions while enabling international cooperation? Boosting Europe's security is a clear priority for the new Commission, and President von der Leyen is already making a good show of European strengths and providing a clear sense of direction on staying true to European values while navigating a multipolar world. But what will this look in practice, and how will this hold through a very kind of chaotic year? What place will the EU social model occupy over the next 5 years? The doctrine emerging from the European Commission's new compass focuses on social issues through skill shortages and labor market activation, with a bit on kind of public services and European pillar of social rights, but is otherwise coming short on social fairness, cohesion, and reduction of inequalities, as was noted by the S&D group as well as some of the trade unions in reaction to the compass last week. Finally, underlying all of the above, financing the investment for future prosperity will be critical. The needs are many, whether we're talking about decarbonizing the economy, fueling an industrial strategy, strengthening international aid and partnerships, European defense, or of course support to Ukraine. There's a clear case for a new investment commission, as they've dubbed it, but investment needs will require a significant break from the status quo in several politically challenging areas. So building on E3G's expertise, that of a climate think tank with a global outlook and strong footholds in Europe, we will focus the next 30 minutes on moments and decisions which will drive or hinder climate action and climate politics in Europe. We'll also offer ideas on what could help actually drive a fast, fair, and funded transition to climate safety for all. We've tried to be selective, focusing on issues that will be on the mind of European leaders over the coming months. But even then, we will not be able to cover everything in the opening presentations. For instance, this might be a bit short on the EU 2040 climate targets or the next EU budget, but we definitely remain available to address this in a Q&A or as a follow-up. We're starting with Johanna Lenne, our Associate Director for a Clean Economy, focusing on the industrial policy and the Clean Industrial Deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Manon. So I will be kicking us off by giving a bit of an overview of the Clean Industry Deal, which is the flagship initiative that we're expecting from this new commission. We're expecting it on February 26th. To date, the content of the Clean Industry Deal has been closely held. So it's been remarkable, even at high levels of the Commission, how little there is in terms of an understanding so far of what the content will be. But what we do know is that what we're expecting on the 26th of February is going to focus largely on setting a very clear narrative and the political hooks that we need to see for the legislation that we're expecting throughout the rest of the year. So in contrast to what was the initial plan, which was to get a bit more of a package on the 26th of February, we do know that we're going to see more of a kind of be drip-fed some of the key political decisions throughout the coming year. On the 26th of February, we are also expecting a number of other key pieces, and you're going to be hearing in particular about the Omnibus simplification package from my colleague Jure in a moment. But I did want to note that at the moment, there has been a bit of a dynamic where we've seen the Omnibus simplification package steal the Clean Industry Deal's thunder. So partly because the Clean Industrial Deal is still quite a black box, what we're seeing is that stakeholders from across the political spectrum are really focusing on the Omnibus, focusing on what they can project into that space and have maybe more expectations of what they think they can get out of that. In terms of the Clean Industry Deal specifically, we know the Commission faces quite a challenging task. There's a big set of competing political demands on this particular agenda piece. Man already noted the huge investment gap that Europe is facing at the moment that the Commission have to speak to, and where the Commission actually has fairly little room for manoeuvre without member states actually moving on this. I wanted to draw your attention to a couple other sort of trade-offs we see in this space. So on the bullets here, I've noticed long versus short term. On the one hand, the Commission is being asked with the Clean Industry Deal to set a multi-year broad agenda for the direction of travel for the EU economy. At the same time, they are facing very, very strong asks from a set of industries who are in crisis mode at the moment: steel, automotives, chemistry, chemicals, who are really asking for short-term immediate crisis response. So the Commission will have to do a careful job of kind of threading the needle of being able to satisfy both those kind of long-term demands and those short-term needs. Deregulation versus regulatory support. Here, obviously, I'm talking about the broader simplification agenda. In this moment, at the same time, the Commission, in terms of what it wants to do in the Clean Industry Deal, is actually going to require new regulatory support. So they've talked a lot about, for example, building lead markets for green industrial products. That is going to require some enhanced regulation. So being able to balance this element of simplification in this moment and the demands for rolling things back with the fact that a lot of this package also requires more regulation. And finally, new versus old industries. The Commission has talked a lot about the fact that this is supposed to be a package, it's supposed to be a deal that speaks to emerging clean tech sectors, but they also want it to be for traditional energy intensive sectors. And that kind of binary is also a bit of a false dichotomy, but there are big differences in terms of the challenges and opportunities available for different sectors at the moment in the EU. So will the Commission be able to actually create a cohesive narrative, create a package that makes sense for these different types of sectors? In view of that, I wanted to specifically draw your attention to three sets of questions that we will be asking ourselves on the 26th of February. The first will be, does this really represent a step change in EU industrial policy? So does it include the hooks that we need to see for deeper shifts in how EU industrial policy is conducted? And the main kind of premise here is that what we've seen from the Commission over the last 10 years is that they've tended to launch one new industrial strategy every 2 years. And these have largely been stock-taking exercises. They haven't really changed the kind of nuts and bolts of how EU industrial policy is done. It still tends to sit at the member state level. We're still mainly depending on the state aid framework as a means of governing this. So we will be looking out for whether the Commission is proposing something innovative, something novel in how coordination of industrial policy amongst member states can be conducted, can be governed. We already saw some hints of this in the competitiveness coordination tool that was recently announced. That focused on how national investments can be coordinated in areas where there are competitive priorities and joint priorities, but it focused mainly on new areas like digital and AI. So it'll be interesting to see what is brought to bear on the sectors that the Commission wants to deal with in the clean industry deal. The second question will be around this aspect of new versus old industries. So what is in it for energy intensive industries? At the moment, these are sectors that are very much on a knife edge in Europe. They are highlighting that there's a real question about their future in Europe. Key projects that they've put online in terms of decarbonizing these sectors are currently, the timelines have been moved back. Corporates are saying that they won't actually be able to take these projects forward in Europe. So the Commission really needs to come forward with a very clear signal of what they're going to do for these sectors. But it needs to both talk to the kind of short-term crisis response and also bring into picture the kind of long-term transition to climate neutrality in this context. And so in that regard, there's a couple of different elements we'll be looking out for. We'll be looking out for what it says about energy prices in particular. That's more about the short-term price response, short-term crisis response. We'll be looking at what it says about direct electrification. This is a really important decarbonisation lever for EU industries that's been completely underplayed to date. And so we'll be looking at to what extent the Commission is starting to put this on a par with hydrogen and CCS, which have got a lot more attention in the past. And we'll be looking at what the Commission is saying about lead markets. They've talked a really good game about this in the past, about standards, regulation, procurement, how you can build demand for green industrial products. We're really seeing what they bring to bear within this package on that front. And I also want to note, obviously, we're coming up to the CBAM review period. There's also a CBAM discussion under the Omnibus package. There's a very live discussion about what's going to happen with this very specific aspect of legislation, of policy for heavy industry sectors. And this might be the main area where we'll be seeing whether the Commission is falling more on the side of short-term crisis response or more on the side of actually what do we need to do to ensure the long-term competitiveness of these sectors as they transition to climate neutrality. The final question is around what is the clean industry deal going to be saying to international partners? We're obviously in a really challenging moment in terms of EU international role, in terms of EU trade policy, the looming threat of US tariffs. The Commission is wrapped up in thinking about how they are going to manage a really careful dance between retaliation and negotiation. And in this moment, the clean industry deal really represents an opportunity to signal to international partners that the EU isn't turning inwards in the face of growing protectionism and competition. We heard von der Leyen's speech at Davos talking about deeper cooperation with a diverse set of partners, that's in the EU's interest. So this is really a key moment to say, okay, clean industry deal, we've got these domestic objectives, but we are also thinking about what this means for the world and in terms of our partnership and how we can live that aspect of really being a credible partner in this context and developing new ways and new forms of alliances in this really difficult geopolitical moment. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Jure Yada, who is the Director of Strategic Member State Engagement at E3G, who will take you through the Omnibus simplification package.
Thank you, Joanna, and good morning, everyone. I think as we've heard from both Manon and Joanna, simplification and the tension with deregulation is very much central to the discussions around the Omnibus, which is where I'll start in sharing our views on what is expected and what is coming this year on the sustainable finance and investment front, which is a critical piece in delivering the transition and in filling the 800 billion euro annual gap identified by Mario Draghi in his report on European competitiveness. So we expect, much like with the Clean Industrial Deal, an announcement on the Omnibus on February 26th. But what is this actually, and where is it anchoring from? So the Omnibus is going to be the first major initiative intended to address the regulatory simplification or burden reduction, and will target three key pillars of the sustainable finance framework, which is the regulation on and directive on corporate sustainability reporting, the CSRD, the EU taxonomy, the classification of economic activities considered sustainable, and the due diligence directive, the CSDDD. And these are all very much anchored in the understanding that Manon and Joanna already shared, which is that the regulatory burden is considered and has been diagnosed now as one of the causes of slow EU productivity and an impediment to the EU's competitiveness. And this has very much been anchored in the assessments coming out of last week's competitiveness compass, which has indeed picked up on the regulatory burden as an area and a key lever to improve and force ahead the EU's competitive position in this increasingly volatile global context. So President von der Leyen has committed and now reaffirmed multiple times in the past weeks the aim to reduce the reporting burden by 25% for companies and by 35% for SMEs. And this has also been confirmed and reaffirmed by commissioners in the last couple of weeks. So as we look to the omnibus, what are some of the key dimensions that are driving both the debates and the assessments of what is likely to come out of the proposals on the 26th of February? So much like with the clean industrial deal, this is a black box. It is being kept very, very closely in certain parts of the Commission. So there is not a clear sense yet of what will be exactly in the drafts that will be shared on the 26th. However, there are three key dimensions that are seen largely to be shaping a lot of the discussions and the considerations. And these are the political. There is a big pressure right now on the Commission to show and send a strong signal on EU action that it will reduce the regulatory burden, anchored again in the assessment that this is an impediment to competitiveness and on the EU's ability to actually matter and to continue to be a competitive economy in the race to a low carbon future for tomorrow. The second is technical. So while there's a political signal that needs to be sent with the omnibus, these are very complex and intricate texts that have been agreed and have gone through the last legislative process. So how can the actual content be balanced and simplified in a way that still leaves meaning and usefulness for investors and for businesses looking, among other things, to get the information necessary from these reporting exercises for their investment decisions and also their business model decisions for the future. And last but not least, there's the geopolitical element, which is very much rooted in the deregulation pressure that's being felt from across the Atlantic, emerging US-EU tensions, which Joanna touched on the trade side, but also this general sense and a question, which is this the best way for the EU to be responding to these deregulation of political pressures from a different jurisdiction? Is this playing to the EU's strength to be doing the same? So as we look to the 26th of February for the omnibus, we'll be considering three key aspects. And the first is really how far will these proposals go, and will they really strike the right balance between simplification and deregulation? And here we'll be considering in particular to assess this potentially fine line, questions such as, will these three regulations be opened at the level of the main legislation? So that's level one in the regulatory speak, which could send very alarming signals to businesses, to investors. And yesterday there was a statement of over 200 investors calling for regulatory stability, calling for the Commission to maintain both the ambition and the clarity that has been put in place with the last in the last mandate for the sustainable finance framework. So what are going to be the political signals given through the level at which these files will be opened? We will also be looking at questions such as, is there going to be a reduction of scope in the number and size of companies that will fall under these regulations? Will there be adjustments to timelines? Will there be delays for implementation, for example, for the due diligence directive? And will there be introduction of voluntary approaches where there are now mandatory assessments? So, for example, on transition planning, reporting for businesses, or for double materiality assessments. So these are some of what we'll be looking at to try to understand the fine distinction between, is this actually a successful simplification effort, or is this more deregulation? We will also be considering the political signal, much in that vein, on whether or not this will be giving the right message around the EU's intention to continue committing to the transition and putting and encouraging the finance flows to go with it. And we will also be asking whether or not this process is setting up the right precedent for future omnibuses. And Commissioner Dombrovskis last week said that this is just one of many to come. There will be a fleet of omnibuses. So what does this mean for that process that's been, by and large, seen to be quite rushed and also not very inclusive, including through closed-door consultations as opposed to public consultations, which will be held today and tomorrow by the Commission and which E3G will attend. And what does this also mean for other regulations in the sustainable finance framework, which have been set aside for review already, such as the SFDR, which is the regulation for financial reporting for financial institutions. Now, very briefly, the omnibus is not the only thing happening, of course, for sustainable finance. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just a quick overview for you all on what is coming in 2025 that we'll also be keeping an eye on. The first is the initiative on a savings and investment union, which we expect to see in the first quarter of this year, very much anchored on the calls in the Draghi report to mobilize European savings and also to better integrate capital markets. We will be looking at the proposals for the EU budget, the next multi-annual financial framework, including announcements on the competitiveness fund, which is newly expected to also help leverage private capital for the transition and for competitiveness first and foremost. And with it, a new competitiveness coordination tool, which was announced in the Compass last week, which is also expected to help align national investments with shared EU competitiveness priorities and really use budget incentives to deliver that. And last but not least, there is the European Investment Bank's new climate roadmap for 2026 to 30, which we expect to see on the horizon. Very important because this is the roadmap for the bank to put climate finance in support of the transition and the achievement of the European Green Deal. And there's some things that only public finance will be able to help advance, including major infrastructure investments such as grids and for energy. Which brings me to passing the floor now to my colleague, Luke O'Callaghan-White, Head of EU Energy Transition, who will take you through the energy dimensions.
Thanks so much, Shira, and thanks everybody for being here this morning. Maybe very briefly, kind of picking up from where Johanna left off, really thinking about the role of the clean energy transition now as an enabler of the EU's industrial framework, I think is an opportunity to really reinforce the potential for clean domestic electricity as a key asset for European competitiveness, for lowering prices, and for enhancing its security position. But much like the industrial political challenges, there are both immediate and long-term issues that need to be resolved in this new mandate. We'll be looking out for the phase-out plan for Russian energy imports, which is scheduled for the 26th of March. This will be an important element, not just for completing the Repower EU agenda, but also a chance to set a framework to phase down Europe's fossil infrastructure and its dependence on volatile gas imports. We know that gas demand is down around 20% since 2019. So this is an opportunity for a catalyst really to bring about a broader phase down and phase out in fossil infrastructure. Rethinking energy security for competitiveness will be a really important challenge for Commissioner Jorgensen in his mandate, in particular this year. The framework for energy security, which is currently under review and we expect to be addressed at the June European Council, we really think should integrate demand-side measures in a much more central way than is current thinking, so that it's both aligned with decarbonisation, but that we are less vulnerable to further supply-driven energy crises. Just as a point of context, in the energy crisis between 2021 and 2022, a total of 4% of EU GDP was used to shield businesses and households from the energy crisis. And this all came at a cost of quite significant infrastructure projects, which are needed to address some of those structural longer-term issues related to, for example, energy infrastructure like grid connection. If we move to the second slide, in particular, just want to highlight the role of energy efficiency here as a missed opportunity. And again, this is something we'll be keeping quite a keen eye on when it comes to the publication of the Affordable Action Plan for Energy Prices on the 26th of February. We'll be looking to see if energy efficiency is referenced, as we're quite disappointed to see it missing in the competitiveness compass that was released last week, despite its strong role in both stabilizing prices by reducing system costs and hedging against volatility. The other point that I think we'll really be looking for here in the action plan for affordable energy prices is whether or not the Commission is looking to help align incentives for direct electrification, both of industry, but of the economy wide. So that brings me to the final point to look at here, is that while there is a strong political pressure to address the crisis of very high energy prices, both for industries and consumers, to increase the strength of Europe's energy security through its framework, incorporating demand as well as supply side measures, there are really structural and market reforms that we're looking to see develop over the course of this year, ahead of the publication of the Electrification Action Plan and the Grids Package at the beginning of 2026. And here we'll be looking for the implementation of the market design, which is critical to both build out the renewables network and electrification concurrently, so that it is an affordable transition for consumers. And also to see the extent to which there is the support in innovation in capacity poor distribution markets, in particular for the grid, to send clear investment signals, to move quickly. This is really a no-regret option. And this urgent action is needed to address what we're seeing happen right now, from very significant price oscillations in the price of electricity in Southeast Europe in particular, and the challenge of failed auctions for offshore wind that we're seeing in quite developed markets like in Denmark. So the Commission has a very clear role here, and that's reconfirmed by the Council conclusions of May of last year, which is that member states want more support on how to implement better flexibility, to support the rollout of smart decarbonized grids in a timely manner. This is, of course, essential for the electrification of industry, but it also serves to support the electrification of the wider economy, which is critical if we're, one, seeking to phase down our reliance on volatile gas imports, increase our energy security, lower prices, and address the competitiveness gap. So both the short-term measures that we're keeping an eye out for with respect to the Commission's plan on the Russian phase-out of energy imports, the Affordable Action Plan, but some of those longer-term structural remedies, such as the Grids Package and the Electrification Action Plan coming at the beginning of next year, will really be some of our core focuses this year as we look at the energy transition in the EU. But with that, let me pass on to my colleague Stefan Menzel, Programme Lead for Climate Diplomacy and Geopolitics.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luke. Excuse me. Now let's zoom out for a moment. I will speak on why this year, why 2025 is a critical year for international climate policy and cooperation. So from 2015, in COP21 in Paris to COP30 in Berlin at the end of this year, it's a decade of climate action, where in 2015 a universal treaty was reached and countries really said, we are all committed to this common cause. 6 years on, in COP26, we saw overwhelming pledges for decarbonization and net zero by mid-century, showing that net zero is possible. We saw early action on coal phase out and on financing the transition. But now really we need to prove that net zero is deliverable for all, and that means foremost the G20, which account for over 3/4 of global emissions and need to lead the pack here. So this is really challenging because the circumstances have not, while we made a lot of progress over the past decade, circumstances have not only changed for the better. We see really cracks in multilateralism, trust is fading, and geopolitics drifting. COP29 has exposed these divisions. A fragile deal, a compromise was agreed there, with progress on the questions of climate financing and cooperation, but divisions exposed, as I said. We also need to see this year, it's a major thing on the road to COP30, new climate plans, new commitments as part of the Paris Agreement, NDCs, nationally determined contributions from all countries for the 2035 timeframe. And one really has to say the momentum overall and ambition in the NDC 3.0 process is low. Leadership is missing. The original deadline for submitting NDCs will pass on 10th February, 5 days from now, and major emitters, including the EU, will not submit their NDCs on time, will be delaying submissions. There are exceptions. In particular, the UK has led with a timely and also very ambitious NDC just recently. I want to stress that missing the deadline, well, it's not great sign for the international process. It's also not the end of the Paris Agreement. It's important that countries come with good plans, proper plans, implementable and ambitious plans, rather than just sticking to the timeline. We still face uncertainty over climate finance and also the ability of the international financial architecture to support climate delivery in developing countries. Emerging economies will have doubts over global support for their transitions, which will limit hence limit their and also the collective ambition. So this year and COP30 in Berlin will really be a make or break moment for the global climate regime. And within this, within the circumstances also of the US retreating, we will need the EU to be part of a global coalition, but also together with key partners, the Brazilian COP30 presidency, the UK, and also, of course, China, to own the international climate agenda and process. So just to reiterate, it will be really important for the EU to deliver an ambitious and timely climate target for the 2035 timeframe, and then we can still seize the moment for a Belém agenda at COP30, 10 years after Paris, where we will see we will need to see a shift from just pledging to delivering. So ambition and implementation at the same time of the transition, and moving into real system change. We will need a robust roadmap to drive sectoral transitions also outside of the UNFCCC process. We will need to elevate non-state actors, cities, businesses, and sustain the momentum there. And here it's important to mention that the latest domestic political shifts across the Atlantic, but in other parts too, are a challenge to subnational and non-state actors' action too. However, multilateralism really needs a win, and climate can be that win, and even counteract geopolitical fractures. Let's move to the next slide now, and I'll say a few words on how broader EU external action relates to this. So the year will certainly bring, again, record climate impacts, disasters, but climate is not top political priority, neither at domestic or in foreign policy. The EU faces pressures from all sides, war and armed conflicts on the continent and its direct neighborhood, conflicts over tariffs and trade from West and East, and great power tensions. We also have a more assertive global South in the multipolar world in which we are in. So how the EU plays its cards now will define its global economic and diplomatic standing, also with regards to the global clean economy. And where does climate now fit with the EU foreign policy priorities? It's straightforward in some instances, not so straightforward in others. So the Commission President has recently doubled down on her ambition to lead a geopolitical commission, and just yesterday in her speech to EU ambassadors described a new hyper-transactional geopolitics, and also indicated outreach to partners across the world in this. So certainly security will be first, defense, regional stability, and also a new strategic neighborhood approach. And in this, it needs not to be forgotten that climate stability is a key component for security. Also for holding the multilateral system together, managing the US, China, and also the BRICS relations, and preserving global order. It needs to be clear that this is also the basis for all global climate cooperation. And then lastly, we heard about the clean EU industrial deal and related external dimensions, and just want to reiterate that for the EU's own core interest in terms of strategic autonomy and competitiveness, the remaining or retaining a leadership position globally, but also building bridges and partnerships across the world on that directly link their the EU's industrial policy and energy security and clean economy is key. So I think there are three important things to watch. On the one hand, really, it's how will EU-China climate cooperation unfold. There is likely to be a EU-China summit in May, which is a key moment to look at in this regard. But also we need to see how in the EU-China play Trump too, or like the Trump administration will be a risk to undercut any EU-China alignment here amidst the trade tensions. I already said it twice, but I say it another time. We really need the EU to deliver on a 2035 climate goal by summer or September at the latest. So it leads by example, and so the process is working. And we need the EU to develop and also deliver on its external dimension of its own clean diplomacy. For example, the EU, the energy and climate vision, the clean trade and investment partnerships, the review of the CBAM, and also financing Global Gateway in the new MFF as an external pillar. So it will be a stress test this year for EU climate leadership globally. The EU will need to push this through the geopolitical noise and own a high ambition COP30 outcome. And it's a geo-economic issue really. This time around, the EU needs to integrate really its finance, trade, and industrial power in this regard. And maybe as a side note, if the EU doesn't lead, the question is who will? China certainly is there, and it wouldn't lead on its own terms. With this global outlook, I will be handing over to Mark Weisgerber now, Executive Director of E3G's Berlin office, who will talk about the implication of German federal elections on the EU. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. So we're just going to the election in the largest member state of the EU, which of course has impacts and implications for the EU going forward. As you know, the snap election is scheduled now on the 23rd of February. The way the government formation will take place has some key moments which stretch over time. So expectation is that the new government may be actually only in place around June. It's unclear, it depends on the other milestones. But for you and for us to watch out, the milestones will have their own political dynamics. And of course, the implications also for the EU, needing Germany, active and proactive in the institutional and process we just discussed in the other introductions. So the election is the one thing. Then there will be a long first informal coalition talks, and as a result of that, there will be formal negotiations. And these formal negotiations between the coalition partners will then end up in a coalition agreement, which in the German political culture and practice plays quite a big role, also for the EU, as this is a quite a large document, so that ranges from 300 to 70 pages. The last one was 70 pages, 70 to 80, and fixes actually basic cornerstones of the new politics of Germany throughout the next legislative period altogether. And practice is that you very much stick to what has been agreed in the coalition agreement. So to watch out is actually what is in the coalition agreement then. And then based on the coalition agreement, you will have a new government, new ministers coming on board. The ministries may be newly cut, responsibility may shift. So there will be a whole dynamics in the coming months, which is important to watch out for, and having the analysis on what that means for the EU processes and dynamics, which we just discussed. So what was the forecast? There's a forecast. Of course, we don't know what the outcome is, but as today, a few days before the election, it's quite likely that the conservative CDU will have the largest fraction in the Bundestag. By that, providing the chancellery, which is Merz. Unclear at the moment is who will be the one or two junior partners in that coalition. The most likely one at the moment, according to polls, would be the SPD, but the Greens are close to the SPD, and there's a whole political discussion around that, which I don't want to go into details, which of the coalitions will be then coming up. There will be an important thing to watch also for implications of the European policies of Germany towards EU. Not only who will be in this coalition, but also will be there three smaller parties at the moment which do not cross in the polls the 5% threshold which you need to pass. But if they're in, that will change maybe also the dynamics of Germany towards EU. So the Liberals, which were part of the former government, might be in the parliament or not, and maybe in the new coalition or not. That's unclear. There's a new phenomenon which is called BSW, which I don't want to go in details, but if that's coming in and maybe in a coalition, that will change the Germany stance towards EU very much. One point, just for the ones who are not so close, maybe in the German system, the AfD, the right-wing extremist, in part right-wing extremist party, will be not most likely, absolutely most likely not in part of the new coalition. For the EU, that means concretely, whatever the coalition will be, there will be across these center-left to center-right parties, there's a broad consensus which is pro-European and pro-EU. So this one will not change. There will be some continuity in this respect. In terms of geopolitics, just to mention one point, there will be, if CDU comes in and leads the coalition, this will be more hawkish towards China and potentially a bit more pragmatic towards Trump administration too, in comparison to other countries. So I give you then, to finish off, if we can just switch to the next slide, please. These are the ones which are now most likely the ones which may form the no coalition. As mentioned, the CDU, SPD, and Greens very much will be probably the play will be around these three. Maybe the Freie Demokraten, FDP, which are the Liberals, will be in. Let's see. What does that mean in terms of EU policy? Apart from the broad-based pro-EU stance, there are differences mainly in terms of regulation versus market approaches about industrial policy, energy policy, and so on. So not going through all the details in what they how the differences are, just to name and to frame a little bit also for you in the upcoming discussions about EU policies of Germany. There are roughly two fractions, so to say, the CDU and the Liberals, very much a focus on market-based solutions, that is ETS and similar measures, and anti-regulation pushes come very much at the forefront even of the campaign in mainstream TV. So there's a strong push anti-regulation, and we discuss what that means then in the former introductions. The SPD and Greens are much more balanced, so they say we need to have regulatory certainties and some sort of planning security on the one side, plus market-based solutions. And these generic, so to say, stances and approaches and strategies then permeates down in the individual packages where they're in favor of or not. And just mention 2 or 3 ones which are the everyday's news: combustion engine phase out, which is there is pushback from the Liberals and the CDU. What exactly that means, where that comes, at what time, in which conditions, whether that's be weakened, softened, or kept as it is, whereas Social Democrats and Greens are very much in favor of keeping the consensus and the decisions at the European level as is. And of course, as mentioned, anti-regulation push means they're pushing very much the CDU and the FDP, but also a little bit SPD and Greens, a pushback on too much bureaucracy. But of course, there are nuances whether that means also a weakening, softening of the rules themselves, or it's just about bureaucracy in terms of the efforts, administrative efforts to comply with the rules. I stop here to allow us time for discussions and hand over back to Isabel.
Thank you, Mark. So, as you said, as we wrap up the input now from our experts at E3G, this is your time to ask any questions. So please type them into the Q&A box if you haven't done so already, and feel free to include your name and affiliation for context. So with approximately 10 minutes dedicated to the discussion, let me go straight to the box to get started on our first question. So we have one by Frederick Simon, Carbon Pulse. What is your take about the timing of the 2040 climate target, which looks like it will be delayed until mid or late March at least? Does that leave enough time to reach agreement in the Parliament and Council before COP30? Manon, would you be able to answer this question?
Sure, and this is a very live question for us as well. I mean, as your question points out, like Frederick, the type of proposal is very uncertain. You mentioned March. I've heard that this may even only come in the summer, the Polish presidential election being a determining factor in the timing of the proposal from what we hear. But in a way, it doesn't matter, because whether we're talking about March or summer, there's no time for kind of a full legislative process to reach an agreement. But when it comes to the EU showing up at COP with an NDC, so like a 2035 target, it doesn't actually require a full legislative process. So I think, and sorry to go really into the depths of like EU processes, but first, I think there's a possibility of dissociating the 2040 domestic target, like the legal agreement on it, which we will need eventually, and the NDC. So the agreement of the NDC is currently on the draft agenda for the June ENVI Council under the Polish presidency. So this is a possibility. But usually for this kind of level of decisions, there's the European Council, so the heads of state step in, and that could be on both 2040 or just the 2035 MDC as well. And there are kind of 3 summits from now until COP30. I mean, Stefan did say that kind of September was a hard deadline, so it leaves kind of 2 meaningful ones. March is probably not going to happen. I mean, I think the inclusion of the 90% in the competitiveness compass, I think was important signal on this, and that could kind of trigger more discussions in March, especially since I believe the UN Secretary General Guterres will be present and kind of talking to European leaders during the March Council. So this could really prompt an initial discussion. June could be a better time for agreement, having had like possibly, as we've heard from Mark, a new German government by then, and post-police elections. Failing that, October, but that kind of cuts it very close and would really fail to leverage the higher ambition for other partners. So we do think that kind of the EU is coming late, and we're hoping for progress on this. Now, there's of course a question of the level of the NDC, and right now, I mean, the risk is that the EU comes late with a very low ambition one. There's kind of different levels that are kind of possible at this stage. I mean, I think the benchmark we have in mind, kind of based on climate action tracker analysis on like what would require for 1.3, sets the bar at like minus 78%. This is I don't think this is really realistic at this stage, but if you're looking at a linear reduction from 2030 to a 90% target for 2040, you're looking at 73% reduction from the EU for 2035. Failing that, I mean, the lower bar would be something around 66%, which would be a linear reduction between 2030 and 2050, which probably would fail to leverage higher ambition from kind of other world economies, and would be actually disappointing and kind of signal from the EU having set that benchmark of a 90% target for 2040. I'll pass back to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Manon. We have another question by Frederick, this time for Joanna. What is your interpretation of CBAM's inclusion in the Omnibus package? What does that tell us about the Commission's intentions there?
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Frederick, for the question. I think the challenge is that we're kind of seeing two different processes around the CBAM. On the one hand, there's thinking about the CBAM in the Omnibus agenda, where what we understand is that this very much sits with Dombrovskis, and it's very focused on the type of admin burden that importers are facing currently. And then you have the CBAM review period, which has been brought forward, which sits under Hoekstra, and where it's really focused on making CBAM work for domestic producers. So there are discussions about export rebates, free allowance, timeline phase out, and these types of aspects. And in a way, these two processes are pulling in slightly different directions. So our understanding at the moment is the Commission is very focused on the former, so admin burden faced by importers, and obviously there's been calls in this context by the EPP on delaying the implementation. So they'll be very much focused simply on that admin aspect and what it means for the importer side of the equation and what it means for actually bringing in the mechanism to start with. What I will note is that our understanding, also talking to a lot of the kind of technical the sort of consultancies and other customs experts who work on this, is the admin burden for importers is enormous, that the Commission did set itself a very huge task in terms of getting this methodology in place as quickly as possible, and that it has been very slow in terms of the importers actually being able to have the data available. So we think there is a valid conversation to be had about exactly how you make this tool work from an importer perspective. But that doesn't mean that there is a strong push or impetus or need to actually delay the implementation of the CBAM. And I think on this front, it's been really interesting to see, again, these different constituencies come into it in different ways. You've seen big industry lobbies, Saint-Bureau, Eurofair, coming out very strongly against the calls from the EPP to delay CBAM implementation, really saying, actually, we've got investments on the line that are predicated on CBAM coming in. We want this protection to come in. And so really this pulling in different directions of member states pulling in one direction, focus on importers pulling in a different direction, and then the producers, the energy intensive industry sectors who say they actually really want this tool to come into place. Obviously, they want things to change about it, but they don't want to see a delay here. So I think, again, there's different political demands in this context, but the Commission's current focus is very much on, what does this mean in terms of importers, the paperwork faced by importers, and does that mean that they need to change something about how it is brought in the next few years?
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Just 1 second as we're getting questions coming in.
I think there's a couple of questions on, sorry to put people on the spot, but I think there's a question on the role of the Polish presidency. And I think maybe Luke could talk about the process on energy security in this context. And let's circle back.
Yep, happy to address that question. Of course, the focus of the Polish presidency is all around security. I think it's really welcome to see energy security as one of the core focuses here. As I mentioned in my earlier remarks, over-focusing on the supply side to the energy security question isn't fit for the decarbonized energy future. It isn't fit for seeing the challenges of energy security in its totality. So we're hopeful that in the first 6 months, with major marking points such as the April IEA conference, which will be co-hosted with the British government, that we can see a bit of progress towards recognizing the multifaceted aspect of energy security, requiring demand-side measures such as energy efficiency, in particular, as a contributing factor to increasing overall energy security. I think what we're also hopeful for is that at the ECO in June, that we will see a meaningful next step on implementing a review of the framework for energy security. And I think this is something that the Polish government have indicated that they're quite keen to keep on the political radar. I think that's very welcome. As I said, I think the critical question will be to ensure that the discussion is not over-dominated by variations in import dependencies, security of supply. They are critical, they are critically important, but they are not the whole story. One of the key ways to increasing overall energy security is the reliance on domestic clean electricity production that is flexible through its network infrastructure and with strong efficiency components. So hopeful that there is still a positive path be forged, with June as being kind of a really key moment, I think, in examining the next step in the security architecture.
Thank you so much. We do have another question on the NDC directed to Stefan. How will the EU calculate its 2035 NDC, given that it will be adopting a 2040 target? Will it be simply a halfway point between 2030 and 2040?
Thanks a lot for the question. So Manon has talked a little bit about it already. So indeed, talks right now are about drawing straight lines from either 2030 or 2050 or 2040 with the different implications in terms of ambition level. But that's not written anywhere. That's right, just where the conversation is right now in terms of simplicity. So there are definitely a lot of other asks from civil society, from scientists, from other actors in this, and it's important to make sure that drawing a straight line from whatever to wherever is not like an automatic or economically or scientific definite or reasonable way. It's a very simple way to structure the conversation at this point in time, and I would leave it here at this point, but happy to follow up on that later on.
Thank you, Stefan. We are unfortunately running out of time, so if you do have any more very pressing questions, please feel free to reach out to us directly. So as we wrap up this briefing on climate politics in the EU for 2025, I want to thank you all, both attendees as well as speakers, for joining us this morning. Now, as we conclude, please note that this briefing has been off the record. Again, the reason being that we want to encourage an open dialogue. However, should you wish to use any quotes, please feel free to reach out to me and we'll be able to support you. Aside from this, we are following many topical developments, some of which we touch upon this morning, and have some interesting publications coming out in the next few weeks and months. So following this briefing, we will provide additional resources in an email, and as the session has been recorded, there will be an opportunity for you to receive a copy of it. So keep an eye out for our mails in your inbox. I will also share relevant contact details to our experts with you. In closing, I want to reiterate our sincere thank you for your time and engagement today. We do look forward to continuing this dialogue in the days and weeks to come. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.